Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It was in the late Michaelmas of '89 when the fog lay in soft woolen folds upon Baker Street and the lamps burned as blurred moons that a visitor of ecclesiastical bearing crossed Mrs. Hudson's threshold and set in motion one of the strangest inquiries it has ever been my lot to chronicle. Holmes had been at the violin, drawing out of the G string a low, musing phrase that matched the weather's melancholy, when the bell rang and a silhouette, angular and ascetic, drifted upon our hearth-rug like a black cutout against the coals. "I am the Reverend Dr. Alaric Mortlake," the apparition announced, with a voice at once refined and strained, "vicar of St. Stephen's, Holborn, and keeper, by unhappy consequence, of what our parishioners call the Black Chapel." Holmes lowered the bow and regarded him with that cool, amphibious gaze which seemed to glide over a man and take his measure from crown to sole. "Pray be seated, Dr. Mortlake," said he. "The Black Chapel, an epithet with a whiff of the theatre. I trust the matter that brings you is less melodrama than misfortune." "It is death, Mr. Holmes," returned the clergyman, and the words fell like a hand upon the strings, stilling every vibration. "Death in a place where no living foot could have come." I motioned our visitor to a chair, while Holmes, with his air of indolent attention, flung himself into the opposite armchair and steepled his fingers. "Proceed," said he. "Begin at the beginning and omit nothing, however small or unseemly. In my experience, Providence loves to tuck the hinge of a case into the least likely crevice." Mortlake's thin hands worried the brim of his hat. "Beneath our church, Mr. Holmes, there is an older chapel, Norman, some say Saxon, which the city, with its kindness for ruins, has never quite buried. The stones are dark with age and smoke, hence the vulgar name. It is reached by a narrow stair from the north transept and is kept locked, save when I am there. Last night, this will sound absurd, I locked it at 10 of the clock myself. The verger, old Cribbins, walked with me. We descended, I checked the bolts, we came up, I turned the key and placed it in my pocket. "Good," murmured Holmes, "your certainty of the lock becomes our first certainty." "At midnight," continued Mortlake, "the chapel bell tolled." "A bell!" I exclaimed. "Below ground?" "Not a great bell, Doctor, but a sanctus bell, hung above the little altar, a relic the antiquaries quarrel over. Its rope runs through an oculus in the arch. No wind can stir it, and besides, the rope was cut a week ago after boys found their way down and played the mischief. Yet 12 strokes sounded slow and regular, witnessed by the constable on the Holborn corner, by the sexton across the square, and by myself, for I was roused in the vicarage and heard them beyond doubt. When we reached the church, the doors stood as I left them. The transept stair was locked. There were no signs of entry. "And below?" asked Holmes, his eyes half closed. "We dared not open until dawn, when Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived. He has attended to a series of thefts of church plate in the district, and was not unwilling to see the matter. We went down together. The air was chill and rank with incense long evaporated. There, at the foot of the altar, the body of a gentleman lay upon his back, his hands folded as if in prayer, a black rook of a chessman clenched within the right. Holmes's fingers lost their steeple and fell to the chair-arm. "A rook, you say?" "Polished jet or something like it. The face was known to me." "Mr. Lionel Perrown, an antiquary, and lately adviser to the bishop on certain diocesan manuscripts. He has visited me twice this month to examine a palimpsest we hold in our vestry. I confess," the clergyman added in a shaken whisper, "that I think him to have been a good man. How he could have been there is—" Mr. Holmes, the stair above, was bolted. The little lancet windows stand 4 feet from the pavement outside, and are barred with ancient iron. The oaken door that gives upon the lane has not been opened in my incumbency. There was dust upon the stones. Our dust is black as soot, and no trace of any footprint save our own from the threshold to the altar. Yet the bell tolled, and the dead lay beneath it. Holmes had half risen, but sat again. "Describe the chamber." Mortlake pressed his hand to his brow, collecting himself. A rectangle not 20 feet by 12, groined with low arches, the vault stained as if with smoke. At the east end, a rude altar of stone, on it 2 candles, which I last saw stumps, though in the morning one was burned to the socket, and the other stood untouched. The Sanctus bell hangs at the right by a bracket. Its rope, cut short, dangles above the floor. There is a piscina, long disused, and a sedilia. The pavement is uneven, the dust lies thick where no foot treads. Mr. Perrown's hat was near his shoulder. His watch had stopped at 12. "At 12 precisely," said Holmes. "Precisely." "And the verger, this Cribbens, what of him?" "A faithful creature, if a little given to tales. He swears he heard a whispering in the stairwell when we listened at the door. But I heard nothing save the settling of old stones." Holmes glanced at me with a gleam that I have come to recognize, a glint not of excitement, but of concentration, as though some private chord had quietly answered. "Lestrade," he said. "You mentioned him." "Yes. He has sealed the place and taken charge of the rook. There was a paper too, a strip of vellum in the deceased's left hand, as if torn from a larger sheet, with some Latin words, subscello non intra. He handed it to Lestrade. The inspector laughed. He thinks it a student's jest. But he is uneasy all the same, for the Yard is today mocked by the press for its failures, and Mr. Perrown was to dine tonight with the Home Secretary's secretary. There will be talk, there is always talk, when great men's names draw near trouble. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, upon which he laid his hand, tapping lightly with his fingertips, as if beating out the cadence of the 12 strokes. "The dead man's character?" he asked without turning. "Studious, courteous, perhaps a trifle secretive. He had enemies only in the sense that scholars have, that is, men jealous of their readings. He quarrelled last week, I am told, with Sir Felix Darnley, a patron of antiquities, whose purse strings tie many mouths, but that is gossip. And the chapel's sobriquet, black, owes itself merely to the hue of age." Mortlake hesitated. "The city has its superstitions. They say a passage once ran from the crypts to the river for priests in older days, and that something wicked travelled it. I do not traffic in such tales, Mr. Holmes, yet last night, when the 12th stroke fell, I confess I wished for daylight." Holmes turned then, all lassitude vanished, his face thin and eager, the hawk awake. "Dr. Mortlake," said he, "you have done perfectly to come. Pray do not be alarmed if I say that the details you provide, especially those which seem least material, are invaluable. Dr. Watson and I will attend you to Holborn within the hour." The clergyman rose with a visible easing of the shoulders. As he made to go, his hat brushed the table, and a fine sprinkling fell from the brim to the wood. I leaned closer. It was a black dust, as from a chimney, but with a faint sparkle like powdered glass. "You have been down there since morning," Holmes observed mildly. "Only to pray," said Mortlake, abashed. I feared that leaving him would be unchristian. But I touched nothing." Holmes gave the ghost of a bow. "You touched enough to bring the chapel with you. One last question. The Sanctus bell, does it stand free of the wall?" "It is on a small iron bracket affixed to the pier," Mortlake replied. "The bracket is firm." "Very good. Watson, your thick boots and the lantern. The fog will do us 2 services tonight. Cloak us from the gapers, and receive a confession the air of Holborn has long owed to those old stones." He drew his Inverness about him and took up his stick. 12 strokes with a severed rope, a sealed stair, and a barred window. A dead man who grasps a rook, and a whisper that speaks in Latin of beneath, not within. If Lestrade calls this melodrama, let him. To my ear it is a fugue, and the subject is cunning. As our visitor plunged again into the grey stair, Holmes paused at the threshold and looked back with a smile which I can describe only as anticipatory. "We go, my dear Watson, to a chapel that is black by repute and by powder," said he. "Let us see whether its darkness lies in stone or in a man's design." The cab rattled east through a muffled London, the lamps pricking the fog like pinheads through muslin, while the clop of hoofs came back to us in dampened echoes. Holmes, who had sunk into his corner with chin upon breast, appeared sunk also into reverie. Yet I observed the bright, needle-like glances he sent, first to our client's cuffs, then to the smear upon his hat brim, and finally to a tiny rent in the lining of the pocket that held the chapel key. "You will do wisely, Dr. Mortlake," said he at length, "to send word to your verger to keep away from St. Stephen's until we arrive. His zeal outruns his caution, and tonight caution must set the pace." Mortlake started. "You cannot have seen Cribbins since morning." "True," Holmes returned, "but one sees the absence of bees in a hive when the comb is torn. I smell black incense on your sleeve, frankincense adulterated by coal tar, and yet your left cuff is free of the powder, while your right bears a ridge where a cord pressed it not an hour ago. You prayed below at noon, as you told us, but you have been again this evening, and in haste. You dragged at something with a short length of rope, and knotted it hard before abandoning it, afraid, perhaps, to be discovered." The clergyman coloured. "I confess to a pang of conscience. The bell and the dead upon the stones haunted me. I thought to fasten the rope end so it would not look profaned." Holmes put out a deprecating hand. "Your motive is human, which is to say mixed, but it has left a mark valuable to me." He then turned his grey gaze to the street, where the silhouettes of passers-by swam like shadows on a lantern slide. "Consider, Watson," he murmured, "the Latin strip, sub sacello non intra. Beneath the little chapel, not within it, a proud rook in a scholar's fist. One candle spent, the other spared. These are not the gestures of accident." We descended in Holborn to find the square nearly deserted, the church looming above the fog with its tower a darker blot upon dark. A constable saluted, and in the north transept Lestrade awaited us, quick, ferret-eyed, and offended by the mere fact of mystery. "So here we are again, Mr. Holmes," said he, rubbing his hands. "A bell that rings without a rope, a door that opens without a key, and a corpse that finds its way into sealed holes like a rabbit. I suppose you will tell me next that the murderer rode the underground air." Holmes smiled in that thin fashion of his which promises work rather than argument. "If he rode anything, Inspector, it was the habit of other men's assumptions." He took the lamp, stooped at the stairhead, and held the flame close to the keyhole. "Observe the dark crescent upon the brass, fresh dust driven inward, not outward. The door has been opened since morning by one who feared to leave a trace. Yet even fear has its handwriting." Mortlake unlocked the bolts, and we went down in single file, Lestrade immediately behind my friend, I following with the lamp held low. The air had the bite of a cellar and a curious sweetness, as if spices had been burnt long ago and never wholly forgiven by the stone. At the foot, the chamber widened with the suddenness of a cave. The altar crouched at the east like a beast of basalt. I could not keep my eye from the little bell, which hung prim and innocent above a bracket scarcely a foot from the arch. "Hold the light steady, Watson," Holmes murmured. He stooped, examined the bracket, then the rope end, whose fibres were clotted and glazed. "Heated," he whispered. "Cut while warm, to prevent fray. Inspector, your rook, if you please." Lestrade produced a small packet and undid it with grudging care. The chessman lay upon his palm, black as jet and faintly greasy, as if a film of oil lived upon it. Holmes touched it to the stone and then to his tongue. Not jet. Lignite pressed with paraffin, a modern counterfeit of an ancient game. Our antiquary held a modern lie in his hand. Lestrade sniffed. Counterfeit chessmen hardly hang men from bells. "No," said Holmes gently. "But they are voices in a choir. We must hear the bass." He crossed to the piscina, ran a finger round its bowl, and lifted from it a pinch of glittering dust which looked like ground mica. "Note the sparkle, Watson, not soot alone. Finely crushed glass, such as glaziers make when they rake their floor sweepings. Spread that across a pavement, and the foot that treads it will carry a whispering shine. See here." With the flat of his blade, he drew a line across a flagstone near the altar. The lamp made the dust glimmer. A tiny path, irrational and yet precise, ran from the door to the sedilia, not straight, but zigzagging like a knight at chess. "A knight's move," I blurted. Holmes's eyes twinkled. "The rook in a dead man's hand and a knight upon the stones. Our murderer is playful, or proud, or compelled by a message." Mortlake, who had stood with clasped hands, gave a small cry. "Mr. Holmes, the palimpsest in our vestry, the one Mr. Perrown examined, contains a fragment from a monastic rule about penances. There is mention of the game of the Black Kings, forbidden in Lent." "Useful," said Holmes, and he paced the chamber, counting softly. At the 6th step, his boot grated on a flag that yielded the thickness of a coin. He knelt instantly, whisked out a steel probe, and slid it along the joint. There came a faint metallic ring. "Subsacello," he murmured. "Beneath, not within." He tamped the dust smooth again and rose as if nothing had occurred. "We will not open it tonight. There is a better way." "Which is?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes's glance went past him to the oculus above the altar where the rope once ran. He lifted the lamp and peered up. The circle was black as a pupil. The bell tolled 12, regular and slow, with no rope to serve it. "There is a tongue, too. Every bell, Inspector, and a lever to every tongue. If I were a man who wished to ring a miracle, I would not pull, I would balance." He set the lamp upon the altar, took from his pocket a length of thin cord, and, after a delicate climb upon the sedilia, looped it over the bracket and let it fall. The drop made the bell give a single, crisp note. "So," he said softly, "the air answers us, Watson. Tomorrow we must speak with Sir Felix Darnley, and tonight we must watch a door that appears to guard the dead, but in fact shepherds the living." The fog still clung to the eaves of Holborn when we emerged from the Black Chapel, the faint toll of that single experimental note still vibrating somewhere in the marrow of my bones. Holmes walked ahead without a word, his long strides cutting through the mist, his head bent slightly, as if measuring unseen distances between clues. Lestrade trudged behind us, grumbling about fancy theories and balancing ropes, yet even his cynicism had softened since Holmes's quiet discovery of the loose flagstone. Mortlake followed in mournful silence, the heavy key swinging from his fingers like a guilty conscience. When we reached the cab, Holmes stopped so suddenly that I nearly collided with him. "Inspector," he said, "lock the chapel again and post your man at both the transept and the vestry. If my calculations are sound, the thief, if not the killer, may return tonight, believing the ground undisturbed. Watson and I will call upon Sir Felix Darnley at once. There is light yet to be caught before dawn." Lestrade scowled but obeyed, muttering something about another wild goose across the city. Holmes hailed another cab, and within minutes we were rolling northward through the sleeping streets. "You recall, Watson," he said presently, "that Dr. Mortlake spoke of Mr. Perrown's quarrel with Sir Felix Darnley. It is an old quarrel dressed in new clothes. Both men sat upon the Diocesan Antiquities Committee, and both coveted the same manuscript, the palimpsest Mortlake keeps locked in his vestry. If a counterfeit rook was found in the scholar's hand, what would you wager that other counterfeits lie hidden in the shadows of that quarrel?" I suggested hesitantly that Perrown might have discovered a forgery, perhaps one implicating Darnley, and been silenced before he could speak. Holmes's smile flashed faintly in the dim light. "You are, as ever, warming to the truth, my dear Watson, though you add too much heat. The matter is not only one of theft, but of pride, and pride moves subtler levers than greed. Mark that the dead man's watch stopped at 12. Not before, not after. The murderer chose that hour with intention. A man who kills by symbol, not passion, leaves behind an architecture of reason." Our cab stopped before a grand Georgian house whose columns loomed pale through the fog, like the bones of a forgotten temple. A night servant, blinking and incredulous, admitted us to a drawing-room where every object seemed to gleam too brightly, as though its owner mistrusted shadow. Sir Felix Darnley entered in a dressing-gown of crimson silk, his pale, leonine head thrust forward with impatience. "Mr. Holmes," he said sharply, "this intrusion at such an hour, what does it mean? I have already told the police all I know about Mr. Perrown's unfortunate end." Holmes bowed slightly. "I do not doubt you have told them what you know, Sir Felix. I wish only to confirm what you have not said. You quarrelled with Mr. Perrown last week regarding a certain palimpsest?" The baronet's nostrils flared. "We disagreed, yes. The man was obstinate. He misread a passage, insisted on a translation that cast doubt upon the authenticity of my own collection. I am a patron of honest study, Mr. Holmes, not a conspirator in ecclesiastical frauds." "Indeed," said Holmes, and his eyes wandered idly about the room. "You possess a remarkable eye for detail, Sir Felix. Those chessmen upon the mantel, are they yours?" Darnley turned. "They are. An antique Venetian set. Why?" Holmes stepped closer. The black pieces were of the same oily sheen as the rook we had seen in the chapel. He picked one up delicately, a knight carved in the same modern counterfeit. "Exquisite workmanship," he murmured, "though not of Venice. These were pressed from moulds within the last 10 years. Curious that your collection and the dead man's relic should share so recent a birth." Darnley's face blanched. "You mean to accuse me of murder because of a chess set?" "Not of murder," Holmes replied softly, setting the piece down, "but of a knowledge you have not confessed. When you last saw Mr. Perrown alive?" "Yesterday afternoon. He came here, uninvited, raving about deception and lost heritage. He accused me of tampering with the vestry records. I ordered him out. And afterward? I dined alone and retired before 11. My servants will confirm it." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Sir Felix. Your candour is appreciated, and your servants shall indeed be questioned. But there is one more matter." He moved toward the fireplace and touched the soot upon the andiron. "Have you burned anything recently? Paper, perhaps?" Darnley hesitated. Old correspondence, nothing else. Then I shall trouble you no more, for now. Good night, Sir Felix. Outside, Holmes's breath smoked in the chill air. There is our counterfeit, Watson. He collects the same false relics that killed a man beneath a church, yet he fears to destroy evidence lest the flame betray him. We returned to Baker Street at 2:30. Holmes threw himself into his chair, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the armrest. The question, Watson, is not who, but why, and more precisely, how. A sealed crypt, a tolling bell, a body arranged as though for ritual. The physical impossibility conceals a moral one. Consider, the bell was rung from above, yet the door below was bolted. The floor moves. The clue lies not in death, but in design. We shall need a diagram of St. Stephen's foundations by dawn. He fetched a volume of parish histories from his shelf and spread it across the table. Beneath his pencil, the church's plan took form: nave, transept, vestry, and the crypt below. Here, he muttered, tapping the north wall. The supposed stair to the chapel runs adjacent to the vestry. If a man wished to enter unseen, he could do so from within the vestry by means of an old passage sealed for centuries. The inscription, sub sacello non intra, may not refer to the burial of a man, but to a way beneath the sacellum itself. He rose, pacing. We must test the theory. At dawn, we return. If there is a passage, it lies behind that vestry wall. He paused, his voice dropping to a murmur, almost to himself. And if someone is bold enough to ring a dead man's bell, he will not resist a second performance when darkness falls again. As I banked the fire and turned to my room, Holmes still stood in the lamplight, the rook glinting black upon the table beside him, his expression remote and sharpened like steel. The fog pressed faintly against the windows, and somewhere, far off, a church bell struck 3, slow, deliberate, and strangely familiar. Holmes was awake before sunrise, his lean figure silhouetted against the pale window, while the city outside still slumbered beneath its grey veil. A map of St. Stephen's, spread upon the table, was already fretted with pencilled notes and cryptic arrows. He spoke without turning as I entered, the kettle in my hand scarcely begun to steam. The vestry wall, Watson, the north section, 3 feet from the stair, has been thickened by later masonry. The parish records mention no such alteration before 1824. We shall find our passage there. I poured the tea in silence, for experience had taught me that Holmes's early morning certainty was never the offspring of chance. "And Darnley?" I asked. "A proud man," he replied, "and a frightened one. Pride builds facades, fear fortifies them. He lied last night, not about the quarrel, but about what was burned in that fireplace. The ashes were not paper but vellum, a scrap of the same sort found in Perrown's hand. He destroyed the remainder of the message, leaving us only its clue, beneath the chapel, not within. By 7 o'clock we were again in Holborn. The fog had thinned into drifting ribbons through which the tower of St. Stephen's rose ghostly and severe. Dr. Mortlake awaited us by the railings, his face pale from a sleepless night. "Inspector Lestrade has been here since dawn," he said in a low tone. "He insists that no one has approached the transept, yet he is ill at ease. He says the dust within the chapel has been disturbed." Holmes's brows lifted. "Excellent. That means our quarry grows impatient." We entered the vestry where Lestrade, lantern in hand, was examining a narrow portion of the north wall. "You'll see for yourself, Mr. Holmes," he muttered. "Nothing but stone and plaster here. No passage, no miracle." Holmes tapped the surface lightly with his cane. The dull resonance changed midway down. "A hollow echo, Inspector. Your miracle stands behind 4 inches of lime." He took a thin blade from his pocket, pried gently between the joints. and a flake of plaster fell away to reveal brickwork newer than the rest. "Fetch me that crowbar," he said. Mortlake recoiled. "You mean to break the church wall?" "Merely to let in a little truth, Doctor," Holmes answered. A few strokes sufficed, the bricks yielded, and a square cavity yawned, exhaling a breath of stale, cold air. Within was a narrow flight of steps descending into darkness. Lestrade muttered an oath. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Watson, your lantern! The builder who sealed this passage worked in haste. See how the mortar was smeared by unskilled hands. Someone reopened it recently from below." We descended, the steps twisting sharply until they opened into a low tunnel. The smell of damp stone mingled with something sharper, metallic. The walls glistened faintly as though brushed by oil. At last the passage ended in a small iron door barred on our side. Holmes crouched, examined the latch and whispered, "This opens directly into the Black Chapel. A thief could enter from the vestry, ring the bell by mechanism, and vanish before any pursuer reached the stairs." He slid the bolt and we emerged behind the altar where the loose flagstone had betrayed itself the night before. The chamber lay unchanged, save for one thing. The candle that had been burned to the socket now stood renewed, its wick trimmed. "Someone has been here," I murmured. Holmes bent to the stone. A faint print, half a heel and the square edge of a boot, showed in the dust, too fresh to be more than an hour old. "A heavier man than Perowne," he said softly, "but lighter than Lestrade, Darnley, I should judge, or one who wears his shoes." He straightened, his expression sharpening to that inward tension I had learned to read as the prelude to revelation. "Watson, do you recall the mica powder on the floor? It was meant not only to mark paths but to reflect light. Observe the roof." I raised the lantern. Across the groined arch, faint flecks glittered, minute shards embedded in soot, forming the outline of a cross above the altar. Holmes drew a breath between his teeth. So, a signal to guide the descent through darkness. Whoever entered knew that the light from a single candle would strike those particles and lead him to the slab that lifts. We are dealing not with superstition, but with architecture and a brain that maps both. Lestrade was staring upward, baffled. "You mean the killer used this place as a sort of stage?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He required witnesses who would swear to impossibility, a bell rung by no hand, a sealed door, a corpse arranged in sanctity. His purpose was to cloak murder beneath miracle." He paced once round the altar, stooped suddenly, and drew out from beneath its base a small object wrapped in linen. Unfolding it, he revealed a glass vial stoppered with wax and labelled in cramped script, "Oleum fossil, lignite extract." "This," said Holmes, holding it to the light, "is the very oil that coated the chessmen, flammable, odourless when burned, and used to give an antique gloss to modern carvings. The rook, the knight, the set upon Darnley's mantle, all were treated with it. Perowne discovered the deception. The murderer silenced him before exposure could follow." Mortlake clutched at his cassock. "Then Sir Felix—" "We shall see," Holmes interrupted. "But note this, the dead man's watch stopped at 12 because the mechanism was drenched with the same oil. It thickened, halted the spring, and fixed the hour. Our murderer meant the very clock to corroborate his ghost story." He turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Place a man at Darnley's house. If he attempts flight, detain him, but tell him nothing of what we found. Fear will move him faster than guilt." As we ascended to the vestry, the daylight had grown wan and uncertain. Holmes paused on the threshold, his gaze wandering to the tower that loomed through the fog. "There will be another signal tonight," he said. "The bell was rung not once, but twice, the second time to test whether the deception held." He must return to erase what evidence remains. He pocketed the vial and added, almost to himself, "And when he does, he shall find that the Black Chapel rings for him alone." We left Lestrade to arrange his watchman and returned to Baker Street for a few hours' rest. Holmes touched no food, spoke scarcely a word, but sat by the window, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. When dusk crept again over the roofs, he rose with abrupt decision. "Watson," he said, "bring your revolver. Tonight we attend evensong in the Black Chapel." There was something in his tone that banished fatigue. We went out once more into the drifting mist, the street lamps blooming like pale planets overhead. London lay muffled and expectant, as if the city itself held its breath for the stroke of 12. And beside me, silent save for the soft rhythm of his steps, Sherlock Holmes moved with that air of preternatural purpose which always preceded the moment when reason, like dawn, would break through the dark. The fog was denser that evening, creeping low along the cobblestones, as if it meant to swallow the city whole. When Holmes and I returned to St. Stephen's, the air was damp and chill, the street silent save for the faint echo of our own steps. A constable stationed near the transept door saluted stiffly as we approached, his breath forming pale clouds in the air. Holmes's lantern was shuttered, its narrow slit casting only a blade of yellow upon the stones. "All quiet?" he asked in a whisper. "Aye, sir," said the man. "Inspector Lestrade was here not an hour ago, said to keep an eye on anyone near the vestry. No one's passed this way since dusk." Holmes nodded. "Good. Keep to your post. If you hear the bell, do nothing. Not a sound, not a step. It is silence that will catch our man." Inside the church was a hollow shell of gloom. The great nave, dimly lit by a single lamp near the altar, stretched before us like a cavern of sleeping stone. Holmes led the way with that noiseless precision peculiar to him, the kind of movement one associates less with a man than with a thought taking form. At the transept, he knelt and examined the lock. It bore faint scratches at the keyhole, fresh, deliberate. "He's been here," he murmured. "The metal's cold but not clean. It was handled within the hour. Watson, take note of that. Our quarry grows impatient." He opened the door with the duplicate key Lestrade had lent him, and we descended once again into the narrow stair that curled like a corkscrew into the earth. The air was heavier now, thick with the odour of oil and something faintly acrid. At the foot of the stairs, the Black Chapel lay as before, though its shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The two candles upon the altar stood dark. Holmes struck one alight, the flicker of the flame glancing off the stone walls and kindling those scattered flecks of mica in the vault above. "Observe," he said softly. "Even a single flame is enough to awaken the signal. Our man will see it, though he believes himself unseen." He crossed to the passage we had uncovered that morning, its bricks now hastily remortared by Lestrade's order. A small gap remained where Holmes had pried the plaster loose, and through it one could glimpse the faint glimmer of the vestry beyond. Holmes examined it, then withdrew a coil of fine cord, and attached it to a small bell of his own contrivance, barely larger than a thimble. "An ear in the dark," he whispered. "Should the passage stir, we shall know." We waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The candle guttered low, its flame shrinking to a steady tremor. I confess that my mind began to wander, to the absurd stillness, to the echo of distant carriages somewhere far above us, and to the cold stone beneath my boots that seemed to hum faintly, as if remembering the life that had lain there. Holmes remained motionless, crouched behind the altar, every line of his body tense as a drawn wire. Suddenly he lifted a finger. The faintest vibration, a tremor through the cord, reached us. Then a sound, a muffled scrape from beyond the vestry wall. Someone was descending. Holmes doused the candle with a swift pinch of his fingers. The chapel sank into blackness so complete that I could see nothing of his face, only feel his nearness. A moment later, the old iron door behind the altar creaked softly. There came a faint glow, the intruder's lantern, its light seeping in a thin line through the crack. The door opened inward. A man entered, stooping, his steps cautious but sure. Holmes's hand closed on my arm, urging stillness. The newcomer advanced to the altar, and as he raised the lantern, its glow fell upon his face. It was Sir Felix Darnley. He was pale, his hair disordered, and his expression one of strained resolve rather than fear. He set the lantern down, drew a small hammer from his coat, and knelt beside the loose flagstone. In the silence I heard his breath, quick and ragged. He lifted the stone carefully, revealing beneath it a shallow cavity. From it he drew a parcel wrapped in oiled cloth, and when he opened it, the gleam of gold plate and jewelled chalices caught the faint light. "The stolen relics," I whispered before I could stop myself. The sound was slight, but enough. Darnley froze, his head turned sharply, eyes searching the shadows. Then with sudden fury he snatched the lantern and hurled it toward the corner from which the whisper had come. Holmes sprang. In an instant he had flung himself forward, striking the man's wrist with his stick. The hammer clattered across the stones, the lantern crashed against the wall and went out, leaving only a dim orange glow where oil smouldered on the floor. Darnley struggled fiercely, but Holmes's wiry strength was extraordinary. In a moment he had twisted the man's arm behind his back and pinned him against the altar. "You are quick, Sir Felix," he said calmly, "but quick enough to silence a bell that tolls for your own sins." Lestrade's voice came from the stair above, urgent and breathless. "Holmes! We heard the crash. Are you safe?" "Perfectly," Holmes replied. "Bring your light." When the inspector entered, the scene before him might have been some infernal tableau, the fog creeping through the doorway, the embers flickering on the floor, and Darnley's white, desperate face pressed against the stone. Holmes released him and stepped back. "You see, Inspector," he said, "our miracle worker returned to reclaim his treasure." The Black Chapel served him as both vault and theatre. He concealed the stolen plate beneath the altar, walled a passage to ensure secret access, and staged his victim's death to resemble divine mystery. The bell, the Latin, the sealed door, all part of a masquerade to confound inquiry. Darnley sagged to his knees. "He would have ruined me," he gasped. "Brown discovered the forgery. I never meant murder." Holmes's voice hardened. "You meant only deceit, but deceit breeds death as surely as poison. When Perrown confronted you, you struck him down, perhaps with the very hammer you carry, and laid him as an offering upon your altar of lies." Darnley groaned, covering his face. Lestrade nodded grimly to his men. "Take him, lads. I'll have the yard send a cart for the rest." As they led Darnley away, Holmes stood very still, his gaze lingering on the extinguished candle and the rook that still lay upon the altar's edge. "Watson," he said softly, "you see how pride fashions its own chapel. This one was built of greed and fear, but its stones are of a common quarry. There are black chapels in every heart if one digs deep enough." His eyes turned to me, clear and distant. "Come, my dear fellow. The air here is tainted with the past. Let us find the morning." We ascended into the first light of dawn. The fog was thinning, and the bells of Holborn were ringing the hour, not in dread, but in simple, human sound. Holmes paused a moment on the church steps, the faintest smile touching his lips. "A fitting requiem," he murmured, "for both the living and the dead. The morning sun struggled weakly through the mist, washing the grey stones of Holborn in a pale and watery light. The city was already stirring when Holmes and I at last returned to Baker Street, weary but wakeful. Mrs. Hudson, alarmed by our haggard appearance, had barely left the room before Holmes threw himself into the armchair by the fire and began filling his pipe with a deliberate hand. The smoke rose in steady rings, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. Then he said, more to the air than to me, "When a man commits murder to preserve a lie, it is not the crime but the concealment that damns him. Darnley's fall was written in his fear before ever he lifted the hammer." I had watched my friend through many cases, yet seldom had I seen that curious mixture of satisfaction and melancholy which now shadowed his features. "Still," I ventured, "you must admit, Holmes, it was a singularly constructed deception. The mechanism of the bell, the sealed passage, the staging of the scene, all quite extraordinary." He smiled faintly. "Extraordinary, yes, but not inexplicable. Darnley was a man of taste and imagination, the worst sort of criminal, for he dressed his guilt in the garments of genius. Yet even the cleverest architecture of lies crumbles under the smallest grain of truth. It was the dust on Mortlake's sleeve that betrayed the whole design." He leaned forward suddenly, his expression sharpening. "And yet, Watson, something in this affair does not rest easily upon my mind. Darnley's actions were those of a desperate man, but desperation seldom operates with such order. He was precise, methodical, as though following another's plan." I frowned. "You mean there was an accomplice?" Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "Perhaps, or perhaps something subtler. Remember the vial of lignite oil we found? That substance is not common. It is produced in small quantities by only one workshop in London, Farrier and Sons of Clerkenwell. If we discover who purchased it, we may yet learn who whispered the plan into Darnley's ear." Within the hour we were bound for Clerkenwell, the fog lifting as we went, revealing the bustle of early trade, the clang of iron, the shout of costermongers, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the stench of horse dung. The workshop of Farrier and Sons stood at the end of a narrow lane, a grimy establishment filled with the scent of varnish and turpentine. A stooped man in a leather apron looked up as we entered. "Good day," Holmes began smoothly. "You supply lignite extract, I believe, used in the restoration of carvings?" The man's eyes narrowed. "We do, sir. Rare stuff. Hardly anyone buys it now." "Indeed. Perhaps you can tell me who purchased 2 ounces of it within the past month." The man wiped his hands on his apron, frowning. "Well, I keep my orders in the ledger. One moment." He disappeared into a back room and returned with a large book. Holmes leaned over it while the man flipped through pages thick with grime. "Here it is," said the craftsman, tapping a line. 2 ounces of lignite oil, ordered last Thursday by Mr. Lionel Perowne." I caught my breath. "Perowne?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Perowne himself. And the delivery?" "Sent to his address at Bloomsbury, sir." Holmes closed the book gently. "You have been most helpful. One last question. Did anyone collect an order under his name after his death?" The man hesitated. "No, sir. Though now you mention it, there was a gentleman here 2 nights ago asking if we'd received another shipment for Mr. Perowne. I told him we had not. Tall, with a pale face and a scar near his temple. Foreign, I thought." Holmes thanked him and led me outside, where he stood for a moment, gazing abstractedly down the street. "A scarred foreigner, Watson. Not Darnley, not Mortlake, and certainly not Lestrade. We are missing a player from the board." He began walking briskly toward the main road. It is possible that Perowne was not merely a scholar, but an instrument, perhaps of another man's design. Darnley's greed was the lever, but the hand that moved it may still be free. I could see that the thought animated him, for his step quickened as we hailed a cab toward Bloomsbury. The late antiquary's lodgings were in a quiet square, the sort of place where dust lay thick upon window-sills and curtains never stirred. The landlady, a nervous woman with ink-stained fingers, received us with evident agitation. "Such a terrible business, gentlemen. I knew Mr. Brown for 5 years. Such a gentle soul, never raised his voice." "Did he have visitors of late?" Holmes asked. "Oh yes, sir, 2 or 3 times this week. The vicar from Holborn, of course, and a foreign gentleman. Dark, thin, spoke with an accent. He stayed long hours. They quarrelled once, I believe, though Mr. Brown forbade me to mention it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did you happen to hear the man's name?" "No, sir. Only that Mr. Brown called him Doctor, though not the same way he called himself, Doctor of Letters." This one was something else. Holmes thanked her, and we examined the study where Perrone had worked. The desk was strewn with papers and old maps, one corner darkened by a recent burn. Holmes sifted through them until he found a half-charred letter. He held it to the light and read aloud. "Cannot hold them longer. The chalices are already in his care. If you delay, he will use the chapel to draw them off. Remember the rook and the hour." The signature was half gone, but the initial V remained. "V," Holmes repeated softly. "A doctor. Foreign. Scarred. Watson, I suspect we have been chasing a shadow cast by another light entirely." As we left, the wind carried a faint tolling of distant bells. Holmes halted on the pavement, his eyes narrowing toward the east. Darnley believed himself the author of this deception, but he was no more than a pawn. The hand that placed the rook in Perrone's grasp and whispered the words "sub sacello, non intra" has not yet been caught. He turned suddenly, his face alight with that cold, electric fire I had come to know so well. "Watson, we must return to St. Stephen's tonight. There is unfinished business below those stones. I would wager the true architect of this affair has not yet finished his work, and the Black Chapel may yet toll once more before dawn." The fog was rising again as we hailed another cab. Holmes sat forward, his eyes fixed on the distance, his fingers drumming in restless rhythm upon his knee. "One more descent into the dark, my dear Watson," he murmured, "and this time let us see what ghost it is that pulls the ropes from beneath the earth." The day waned into a dim and restless dusk as we approached St. Stephen's once more. The air had turned colder, the kind that bites through one's coat and carries whispers through alleyways. Holmes sat beside me in the cab, his face unreadable beneath the shifting lamplight, yet his fingers betrayed him. They moved ceaselessly upon his knee, tapping an irregular rhythm that I knew well. It was his mind at full charge, assembling the fragments of truth from their scattered hiding places. "Watson," he said at last, his tone low and deliberate, "we are dealing not with a murder alone, but with a design of long patience. The hand behind this affair is not driven by avarice, it is guided by doctrine. The Latin phrase, the relics, the hidden chamber, all point to an intellect that thinks in symbols, not in crimes." I leaned forward. "Then Darnley was but a puppet." "Precisely," Holmes murmured, "a willing one, moved by greed, but ignorant of the full pattern he served. There is a mind behind his, the scarred foreigner, this Dr. V. His handwriting, his planning, his selection of instruments, all reek of obsession and ritual. You see, Watson, men of reason build puzzles to amuse, zealots build them to sanctify." When we reached the churchyard, the fog lay thicker than ever, smothering the lamps until they glowed like submerged stars. Lestrade was there, pacing near the transept steps with his collar turned high. "I thought we'd seen the last of this place," he muttered as we approached. "But the yard's not one to refuse a ghost hunt if Mr. Holmes insists." Holmes offered no reply, only a brief nod as he examined the lock on the vestry door. The scratches he had noticed the previous night were deeper now, and the faint scent of oil lingered in the cold air. "He has been here again," Holmes said, "and he will return. The bell is his voice, and he will make it speak before dawn. Inspector, post your men discreetly at the north and east corners. No interference unless you hear the bell strike 12. Lestrade frowned but obeyed, assigning 2 constables to the shadows, while Holmes and I slipped once more into the chapel below. The descent was as before, a spiral into silence. Yet something in the air had changed. The chill was sharper, the darkness deeper, and the faint shimmer of the mica on the vault seemed almost alive beneath our lantern's dim glow. Holmes extinguished it at once, leaving us in near blackness, save for the dull glimmer of the mica cross above the altar. We waited. The minutes crept by with excruciating slowness. I heard the faint ticking of my watch, the slow breath of my companion beside me, and once a whisper of movement from beyond the vestry wall. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. "Patience," he breathed. "He's here." The sound came again, a soft shuffle, then the creak of hinges. A faint light appeared from the passageway, spilling into the chapel like a ghost's glow. The figure that stepped through the door was tall and narrow-shouldered, moving with a stiffness that suggested injury or disuse. His face was pale, and a jagged scar cut from his temple down across his cheek. He carried a small black case in one hand and a lantern in the other. Holmes's whisper reached my ear, almost inaudible. "Dr. V, our architect." The man approached the altar, setting the case upon it with reverent care. His lips moved in what might have been prayer, though the words were in no language I recognized. Then he drew from the case a small brass instrument, delicate, jointed, gleaming faintly in the half-light. He fixed it to the bracket of the Sanctus bell, adjusting it with surgeon's precision. The faint rasp of metal against metal filled the silence. "An automatic striker," Holmes murmured under his breath, "powered by compression. He means to recreate the miracle without ever touching the rope." The scarred man paused, glancing upward toward the mica cross as if seeking confirmation from the stones themselves. Then from his coat he withdrew another object, a folded sheet of vellum, brittle and yellowed with age. I could see, even at a distance, the faint lines of Latin text and the seal of the church pressed into its corner. "The original charter," Holmes whispered, barely moving his lips. "The one Perrown discovered was forged." The man unfolded the vellum upon the altar, holding it close to the candle he now lit. "Sub secello non intra," he said aloud, his voice a strange, low music that echoed in the vaults. "The secret beneath shall speak once more." Then, with deliberate calm, he turned the striker's tiny valve. The bell gave a single, clear toll that pierced the air like a blade. I confess my heart leapt in spite of myself. The sound hung in the darkness, then faded into silence. A second followed, slower, deliberate, then a third, 12 in all. The same 12 that had tolled on the night of the murder. Holmes moved like a striking serpent. He lunged forward, grasping the man's wrist, just as he reached for the vellum. The lantern toppled, spilling light across both their faces. The stranger let out a sharp cry and struggled with unexpected strength, but Holmes held fast. "Enough," my friend shouted. "Your experiment is over, Dr. Vasilevich, or should I call you the ghost of St. Stephen's?" The man froze, his eyes, cold and luminous, fixed upon Holmes. "You know my name?" he hissed. "I know your trade," Holmes replied. "Forgery, deception, and manipulation of faith. You built Darnley's illusion to draw attention from your theft of relics and manuscripts. He believed himself the center of the plot, but you were the architect all along." Vasilevich gave a harsh laugh. "And yet here you stand, part of the same theater. You English, so eager to unmask miracles, yet so blind to the truth beneath your stones. There is more beneath this chapel than relics, Mr. Holmes. There is knowledge forbidden even to your reason." Holmes twisted his arm sharply, sending the brass striker clattering to the floor. "Knowledge is only forbidden to those who fear it," he said evenly. "And you, sir, fear exposure more than any truth." Lestrade's voice echoed down the stair then, followed by hurried steps. 2 constables burst through the doorway with lanterns raised. Holmes released his grip, and the man staggered back against the altar, defeated. "Take him, Inspector," Holmes ordered. "Our phantom has found his confessional." As they bound Vasilevich's hands, the man looked once more at Holmes, a strange light flickering in his eyes. "You think this ends here," he said quietly. "But the secret still sleeps beneath the stone. You have not silenced the bell, you have only delayed its call." Holmes regarded him without reply. When the man was led away, he stooped to pick up the folded vellum from the altar. He studied it in silence, then slipped it into his pocket. "There are no miracles," he said finally. "Only men who mistake machinery for mystery. And yet—" He paused, his gaze lifting toward the glittering cross upon the vault. "Even a false bell can summon a real shadow, Watson. I fear this one is not quite gone." We left the chapel as dawn began to break again over the city, the fog lifting into thin ribbons of gold. Yet for all the light that touched those ancient stones, it seemed to me that a deeper darkness clung to them still. And in Holmes's silence as we rode homeward, I sensed that he too had heard something in that final toll that reason could not quite explain. The fog had thinned into a pale veil by the time we reached Baker Street once more, but neither dawn nor daylight could entirely dispel the unease that clung to the case. Holmes had spoken little on the return journey. He sat now at his desk, the recovered vellum spread before him, his long fingers tracing its worn edges as if by touch alone he might summon its history. I could see the Latin text, faded, incomplete, yet still carrying a strange dignity, as though the parchment itself held the residue of forgotten centuries. "So it ends," I said at last, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. "Darnley in prison, Vasilevich in custody, and the relics recovered. You've unmasked every player, Holmes. Surely that should satisfy even your restless mind." He looked up, and the lamplight caught the quick gleam in his grey eyes. "Ends, my dear Watson, are an illusion, the point at which men cease to look further. There is something in this matter that continues to breathe. Tell me, what did you make of Vasilevich's last words?" I hesitated. "He said the secret still sleeps beneath the stone. I took it for a madman's raving." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, "but the sane have used madness as a cloak before. Vasilevich is no fool. He spoke of knowledge buried, knowledge, he believed, too dangerous for discovery. What did he mean by that? He is a man of learning, steeped in medieval lore. The bell, the phrase sub sacello, non intra, the repeated emphasis on what lies beneath, it may yet conceal a truth unconnected with his crimes." He rose suddenly, paced to the window, and drew back the curtain. The street below was alive now with morning bustle, the clatter of carts, the cry of the newspaper boys, the chiming of distant bells, ordinary and reassuring. Holmes's gaze remained fixed, however, upon the opposite side of the street, where a man in dark clothing lingered beside a lamp-post, feigning to read a newspaper. "You see him, Watson?" I joined him at the window. "A yard man, surely." Possibly, Holmes said, but one who watches too closely for mere curiosity. He turned away, his expression unreadable. Vasilevich's capture was too easily achieved. I expected resistance, escape, some stratagem. Instead, he surrendered like a scholar closing a book. He wanted to be caught, or to draw attention away from something left undone. He seated himself again, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The vellum, Watson. Look closely at the seal. I bent over it. The wax bore the faint impress of a cross and a crown, but at its edge ran a small indentation, like a second seal overlaid and later removed. You observe it, Holmes said. 2 impressions, one original, one counterfeit. Vasilevich was restoring a document that someone else had already forged. He and Darnley were not partners in deceit, but rivals in discovery. The true origin of this parchment predates both by centuries. Then what purpose did it serve? I asked. Holmes's eyes were distant, his voice low. To mark something beneath the chapel, something of value once buried and long forgotten. Vasilevich's obsession was not theft, but revelation. He wished to uncover, perhaps to protect, what lies below. I fear, Watson, that in arresting him we may have silenced the only man who understood the full measure of this riddle. Before I could reply, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a note upon a silver tray. "From Inspector Lestrade, sir. He said it was urgent." Holmes tore it open and read aloud. "Vasilevich dead, poison in his cell, left no statement save a single line in Latin. The bell tolls for the living, not the dead." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Holmes stood rigid, the paper crushed in his hand. "Cyanide," he said softly as if to himself. He carried it with him all along, prepared for this very outcome, and that final sentence, an enigma within an epitaph. He moved abruptly to the mantelpiece, struck the violin string with the back of his bow, and the low note vibrated through the room. "The bell tolls for the living." He meant the secret was meant to be found, Watson, and it was meant to warn, not conceal. He turned with sudden energy. "There is no time to lose. I must see the Undercroft of St. Stephen's once more, and this time we go not as detectives but as explorers. Bring your revolver. The dead have had their say. Now we must listen to the stones." Within the hour we were again in Holborn, the familiar outlines of the church rising above us. Lestrade awaited us at the gate, his face drawn with fatigue. "I thought I'd seen the last of this cursed place," he muttered. "But your message was plain enough, Mr. Holmes." "You believe there's still something here?" "Not belief, Inspector, knowledge," Holmes replied curtly. "You and your men may remain above. Watson and I will descend alone. I do not wish unnecessary feet disturbing what the centuries have kept sealed." The crypt greeted us with its cold breath, familiar and oppressive. Holmes carried a lantern this time, its steady light brushing over the arches as though reading their silent inscriptions. He went straight to the altar and knelt where the loose flagstone had been replaced. "This," he said, "was only the lid. The cavity beneath was shallow because the builder meant it to conceal, not contain. But what lies deeper? Ah, that is another matter." He drew from his pocket a small chisel and began to work along the seams of the adjacent stones. The echo of metal against rock filled the silence. At last there came a hollow sound, unmistakable and deep. Holmes's eyes flashed. "There! A void beneath, the true cecellum!" Together we pried loose the stone. Beneath it yawned a narrow shaft descending into blackness. A faint, damp current of air rose from below, carrying with it a smell of age and earth, long undisturbed. Holmes lowered the lantern, its beam piercing the darkness. The glint of metal caught the light, rusted hinges perhaps, or the edge of a small iron chest half buried in the soil. He glanced at me, his face alight with grim satisfaction. "So Vasilevich was right after all," he said. "The chapel's secret sleeps, but not forever. The bell tolled for the living, Watson, because it called the curious, and curiosity, as ever, answers." He reached for the rope we had used before, securing it to the altar's base. "We shall see what our dead scholar feared to reveal," he murmured. Then, with one last look at me, a look half warning, half exhilaration, he began his slow descent into the darkness below the black chapel. The lantern swayed in Holmes's hand as he lowered himself down the rope, the golden circle of light shrinking around him until his silhouette merged with the darkness below. I followed close behind, my boots scraping the cold stone, the musty scent of ancient air rising to meet me. The rope creaked, and the faint ring of metal echoed from somewhere deep beneath us, as though the earth itself were remembering its chains. When at last my feet touched solid ground, I found myself in a small chamber hewn from the bedrock, low-roofed and damp, its walls glistening with moisture. Holmes stood a few paces ahead, his lantern raised, illuminating the space. It was larger than I had imagined, more a crypt than a cavity, and along one side a series of niches had been carved into the stone, each containing something long decayed, fragments of wood, tarnished metal, the shapes of forgotten offerings. Holmes moved slowly, his eyes darting from one recess to another. "Observe, Watson, the style of these niches. Norman at first glance, yet the tooling bears the mark of later chisels. This place has been opened and resealed many times. The church above was not the first to lay claim to this ground." His voice was calm, but I could hear the restrained excitement beneath its surface. The lantern's light slid across the far wall and caught on a darker shape, a low arch, half buried in rubble. Holmes was at it instantly, pulling aside stones and earth with his bare hands. "Help me here," he said briskly. "There is a passage beyond. It has been deliberately collapsed." Together we cleared the debris, and soon a narrow opening yawned before us, just large enough for a man to crawl through. Holmes thrust the lantern ahead and stooped. "Come, Watson, keep close." The air grew colder as we advanced, the rough stones scraping our shoulders. After several yards, the tunnel widened into another chamber, smaller but stranger, a circular vault with a domed ceiling from which hung the remnants of an iron chain. In the centre stood a pedestal of stone, upon which rested a chest, bound in blackened iron and eaten by rust. Holmes regarded it silently for a long moment. "The heart of the mystery," he said at last, "and perhaps the heart of the lie." He knelt, brushing dust from the lid, and I saw the faint trace of a symbol etched there, a cross interlaced with a serpent. "Early Templar," he murmured. "An order accused of heresy, secrecy, and forbidden knowledge. No wonder Vasilevich spoke of things too dangerous to reveal. The Black Chapel may once have been a hiding place not for relics of faith, but for relics of doubt." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You mean heretical texts? Forbidden rites?" "Perhaps," said Holmes, examining the corroded lock. "Or something older still, something that men like Vasilevich, steeped in medieval mysticism, would kill to possess." He drew a thin blade from his coat and worked it delicately into the lock. The mechanism yielded with a dull click. Holmes opened the chest. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in decayed leather. He lifted it carefully and unrolled it upon the pedestal. Within was a codex, its vellum pages yellowed but intact, the script faded yet legible, the Latin lines cramped and meticulous. A faint scent of oil rose from it, mingled with something like incense. Holmes turned one page, then another, his brows knitting. "An alchemical treatise," he said slowly. "References to transformation of spirit and matter, to bells and resonance, to, the invocation of sound to stir the sleeping mind." He looked up at me sharply. "Do you see, Watson? The bell, the Sanctus bell. Vasilevich was reenacting the ritual described here. It was never superstition. It was demonstration. He believed the sound itself could awaken whatever consciousness he imagined this place still held." A sound behind us broke the silence, a faint scrape, like a foot upon stone. Holmes froze. "Quickly extinguish the lantern." I obeyed at once, plunging us into darkness so absolute that my breath seemed louder than any movement. The sound came again, nearer this time, accompanied by the slow grind of stone on stone. Holmes's hand touched my arm lightly, guiding me toward the wall. "Someone followed us," he whispered. He waited until we were below. There was a flicker of light, dim, reddish, and a figure appeared at the mouth of the tunnel. For one terrifying instant I thought it was Vasilevich returned from the grave, so spectral did he seem in the gloom. But as he stepped closer, the lantern revealed the gaunt, frightened face of Dr. Mortlake. His clerical collar was askew, his eyes wide and glistening. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "thank heaven I found you. I came to—" He stopped, his gaze falling on the open chest, the codex spread upon the stone. Holmes's tone was ice. "You came to ensure we did not find this, Doctor. You have been watching since the night Darnley fell, have you not? It was you who guided Vasilevich's hand, and when he failed, you meant to finish his work yourself." Mortlake's expression twisted between fear and fury. "You don't understand? It was never theft or deceit, it was preservation. That book is not blasphemy, it is history, knowledge sealed by those who feared it. Perrown wanted to expose it, Darnley wanted to sell it. They would have turned faith into spectacle." Holmes took a step closer, his voice cutting through the dim air like a blade. "And so you killed to protect it?" Mortlake's lips trembled. "He was already falling. I tried to stop him. Perrown slipped." Holmes's voice was steady but merciless. "And when the miracle you staged rang false, you bound yourself to another who would believe your story, the foreign scholar whose zeal matched your guilt. Between you, you turned murder into mysticism." The clergyman staggered back, his heels striking the edge of the pedestal. "You don't know what you touch," he cried. "That book holds the key to something far greater than crime or creed. There are harmonies that move the soul itself." His words broke in a strangled gasp as the stone beneath him shifted. A crack split through the floor, and with a cry he plunged into the darkness below. "Watson, the lantern!" Holmes shouted. I relit it with trembling hands. The beam revealed only a jagged hole where Mortlake had stood, dust and fragments still cascading into the black void. From its depths rose the faint echo of dripping water, then silence. Holmes knelt, peering down. "A catacomb," he said grimly. "He has fallen far, and I fear fatally." We stood in that stillness for what felt like an age. Then Holmes turned, his face pale but resolute. "We shall leave the rest for Lestrade. The dead have claimed their own secret tonight. Let the bell lie silent, and the book sealed once more." He replaced the codex in its chest, closed the lid, and pressed the stone back into place. As we climbed the rope toward the faint circle of light above, the echo of our movements rose through the hollow beneath, a slow, rhythmic sound, like the faint tolling of a bell that the earth itself would not forget. When at last we emerged into the chapel above, the dawn had not yet broken. The air was chill and strangely still, as though the church itself held its breath. Holmes brushed the dust from his sleeves and stood motionless for several moments, listening. The echo from the depths below had faded, swallowed by earth and time, leaving only the faint sigh of wind through the cracks in the ancient stones. His lantern cast long shadows that wavered against the vaulted ceiling, and in that unsteady light his face appeared carved, almost spectral, the eyes dark with contemplation. "So it ends, Watson," he murmured. "The last secret of the Black Chapel lies buried once more, and perhaps rightly so." I looked toward the stair that led down to the undercroft. The rope still hung there, swaying gently with our passing. "And Mortlake?" I asked. Holmes's expression did not change. "If he yet lives, Lestrade will find him. If not, the weight of the centuries will serve as his confessor." He turned toward the altar, his fingers grazing the edge where the candle stubs had melted into pale pools. "It is a curious thing," he went on, "how men of faith and men of reason both fall prey to the same temptation, the belief that truth is theirs to command. Perround sought it in scholarship, Darnley in avarice, Vasilevich in revelation, and Mortlake in salvation. Each followed a bell that promised light, and each found darkness at the end of the toll." I felt the heaviness of his words, as though they were part of the stone about us. "And yet," I said, "what if there was something in that codex, something we've misjudged? The sound, the resonance, the idea that knowledge might be more than words on a page?" Holmes gave a short, wry smile. "You speak like a poet, Watson, and therein lies your humanity. But no, knowledge is a blade, and it cuts as keenly as it enlightens. I have no doubt that Mortlake and his foreign ally believed the power of sound could stir the soul. Indeed, they proved it, if only by the fear they inspired. But the power of illusion is not the power of truth." He stooped and picked up the black rook that still lay upon the altar, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. "A rook, a knight, and a king, all pieces in a game of the mind. Only the hand that moves them knows the end before the first move is played." We ascended to the vestry, where Lestrade awaited us with 2 constables, his face pale in the lamplight. "Good Lord, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed. "The sexton swore he heard shouting down below. What's happened?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "A final confession, Inspector. The vicar descended after us and met the justice of gravity before that of the law. You will find a fissure in the chamber beneath the altar. See that it is sealed." Lestrade looked bewildered. "Another death? This case has the devil's hand on it, I swear, but I'll see it done. And the foreigner, Vasilevich, his death still puzzles the Yard. What was he after?" Holmes slipped the rook into his pocket and gave the faintest inclination of his head. "After what all zealots seek, Inspector. Immortality of a kind. He thought to wake the echoes of the past, but found only his own." We left them then, stepping out into the pale grey morning. The mist was thinning, the first light of dawn brushing the rooftops with a fragile gold. London was waking, carriages rolling, milkmen calling, life returning as though the night's horrors had been a dream. Holmes paused at the gate, his eyes lifting toward the church's tower, where the bell hung silent. "Strange, is it not," he said quietly, "how even the instruments of faith can become the tools of deception? That bell has tolled for saints, sinners, and now for fools. Let us hope it rests content." Back at Baker Street, the fire had burned low, but Mrs. Hudson had laid a fresh breakfast and kindled the grate anew. Holmes ignored both. He took his violin instead and began to play, softly, absently, the same low progression he had played the night Dr. Mortlake first appeared at our door. The sound filled the room like a living thing, mournful, searching, but touched with serenity. I sat in silence, watching the morning light creep across the carpet, until at last He lowered the bow. "Do you recall, Watson," he said, "that I once told you every case begins with a single inconsistency? A footprint too clean, a watch that stops at the wrong hour, a whisper in the wrong ear." Yet in this instance, the inconsistency was not in the evidence, but in the men themselves. Mortlake believed in divine order, yet trafficked in deceit. Darnley prized reputation above integrity. Perrown sought knowledge but feared consequence. Each contradicted his own creed, and so each was doomed to collapse under it. Only the truth remains consistent, however deeply buried. He rose then and crossed to the mantel, gazing into the fire. Still, I wonder what manner of mind first conceived that hidden chapel, or why the codex was entombed there. There are lines in history too faint for even the keenest lens. Perhaps it is well that some secrets remain as dust. "Do you think the codex will ever be opened again?" I asked. Holmes turned, his face half-shadowed. "Not while reason rules the living, I trust. But reason is a frail monarch, Watson, and superstition waits patiently at the gate." He drew from his coat the black rook and set it upon the mantel beside the violin. "A memento," he said softly, "of the game beneath the chapel. Let it stand as reminder that there are no miracles in deduction, only the echo of human folly, ringing through the ages like a bell that never learns silence." Outside, the bells of Holborn began to chime the hour. Their sound was pure and ordinary, yet it carried through the window with such clarity that for a moment I felt the faint tremor of unease return, the memory of that midnight tolling from beneath the earth. Holmes listened, his expression unreadable, and then smiled faintly. "Do you hear it, Watson? The same tone, but now it belongs to the living. Let that be our final note." He turned back to the fire, and the light flickered over his face, softening the hard lines of intellect with something like weariness. I said nothing, for there was nothing more to add. Outside, London moved on, its traffic rising, its voices blending, its endless pulse renewed. But somewhere beneath the ancient stones of St. Stephen's, I imagined the air still holding a faint vibration, a final ghost of sound, a bell's dying echo that time itself could not quite erase. It was 3 days later when Holmes spoke again of the affair. The morning light slanted through the familiar windows of Baker Street, catching the faint curls of smoke from his pipe as he sat in the chair opposite mine. He had been silent since the previous night, immersed in the analysis of the codex, now safely in the keeping of the British Museum at his insistence. Only after hours of stillness did he finally look up, his expression one of quiet finality. "Watson," he began, "you have often remarked upon the line between the rational and the inexplicable. In this case that line was so finely drawn that even I found myself uncertain of which side I walked upon. The secret beneath the Black Chapel was never supernatural, but it was not without its shadows. We uncovered a crime, yes, but also an echo, one that has been repeating itself through the centuries." I set down my cup. "An echo of what?" "Of belief," he said simply. "Mortlake, Vasilovich, Darnley, all were possessed by the same conviction that knowledge confers power. They thought the bell of St. Stephen's could awaken something eternal, truth, salvation, or perhaps merely fear. In their pursuit they mistook sound for meaning, and illusion for faith. The codex they guarded so fiercely is no more than an alchemical curiosity, a treatise on resonance written by a monk who fancied he could speak to God through vibration. There is genius in it, certainly, but no miracle. The only transformation it ever achieved was in the minds of men who could not bear the silence of their own ignorance." He leaned back, eyes half closed, and a rare gentleness softened his tone. It was not the bell that summoned the living, Watson, but the conscience. Mortlake's descent into the abyss was not punishment, it was conclusion. He lived too long among ghosts of his own making. When truth came knocking, he mistook it for judgment. I could not help but feel a lingering melancholy. And yet, Holmes, I cannot shake the sense that the place itself remains different. The sound of that bell, its echo, still seems to follow me. Holmes smiled faintly. Imagination, my dear fellow. The mind is an instrument as finely tuned as any Stradivarius. It remembers vibrations that reason forgets. We stood amid ancient stones that have absorbed the grief and faith of generations. It would be strange indeed if they left us untouched. But remember this: no sound, however haunting, lasts forever. The bell of the Black Chapel has tolled its last. He rose and crossed to the mantel, where the black rook still stood beside the violin. Taking it in hand, he regarded it for a long moment before setting it back upon the shelf. A fitting symbol, he mused, the rook, bold, indirect, unpredictable. It moves not toward the obvious, but by angles, as did the truth in this case. Mortlake believed himself a guardian of sanctity, but his path, like the rook's, led him sideways to ruin. And yet without his delusion the greater deceit might never have been unearthed. Even error has its place on the board. He turned to the window then, watching the steady stream of cabs along Baker Street, the common rhythm of London life flowing on, indifferent to mysteries solved or unsolved. "Do you know, Watson," he said quietly, "there is a peculiar comfort in the ordinary. Men like Mortlake build labyrinths of belief. They seek grandeur where only reason should dwell. Yet I find greater mystery in the simplicity of the world, the ticking of a clock, the creak of a stair, the fog lifting over the Thames. There is no need to chase the supernatural when the natural conceals so much." I smiled. "Then I take it the affair is closed?" "Closed," he affirmed. "The codex remains in safekeeping, the relics restored, and Lestrade will see to the formalities. London may rest from its ghosts." His gaze flicked toward the mantel again. "As for the rook, it shall remain here as a reminder. Let it stand guard over my own folly, should I ever mistake intellect for infallibility." The sound of distant bells drifted faintly through the open window, ordinary bells, bright and clear, heralding the hour. Holmes tilted his head, listening as if savouring the contrast. "There," he said. "You hear it? Honest bells, rung by human hands, no hidden mechanism, no phantom resonance, just metal, motion, and intent, the perfect trinity of reason." He turned away from the window and reached for his violin. "A case, my dear Watson, is like a composition. It begins in dissonance, builds through tension, and resolves only when the final note finds its rest. I believe we have reached that point." I opened my notebook, though for once there seemed little left to record. Outside, the sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, turning the street into a living, golden haze. Holmes drew the bow across the strings, and the melody that filled the room was calm, measured, and resolute, a requiem not for death, but for understanding. When he finished, he set the violin aside and spoke without looking up. "If ever you write of this case, Watson, remember it not as the miracle beneath the Black Chapel, but as the folly of men who mistook an echo for eternity. Truth, after all, requires no bell to proclaim it. It waits in silence for the mind willing to listen." And so I wrote it that way. The newspapers, of course, preferred their own version, murder, mystery, hidden treasure, but I keep the truer story in my notes, the one Holmes himself would have approved. For in the stillness of that ancient chapel, long after the last Vibration had died away. I learned that even the faintest sound of reason can silence 100 ghosts. The rook remains on the mantelpiece still, black against the light, forever poised between faith and logic, its shadow stretching across Baker Street like the memory of a toll that has at last found peace.